All right, welcome everybody and happy Monday. Just going to do some quick housekeeping and see if you guys can hear us.
I heard that.
Hear us and see us okay. Just let us know in chat and perfect. Hey, Eric, good to see you. Can you guys hear us okay? Here's net. Okay.
All right, I think we're good, Andrew.
Yeah, I think we're good. That's probably the smiles and claps of your what is that called?
The hype horn, hype horn button.
Yeah. All right, let's get on into it. We got a great one today. Okay, so in setting today's stage, we had I thought it was nice that kind of leading into this, we had Bob Miller last week. And Matt, I know you've done a lot with Bob on the IR game, probably every one of them. Is that a fair statement?
Everyone I can make. Yeah.
Everyone. Okay. And, it was interesting in that, we've, as Bob pointed out, there's lots of tabletop exercises out there. There's a lot of technical ones like backdoors and breaches and things, but they took it, from a very different perspective, Gary, like right from the business perspective.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really well done, and I love what he's doing.
That was a good show.
Yeah. And then lo and behold, I think the next day or so, the CrowdStrike threat report, one of the really great ones that comes out every year, came out, and I started thumbing through it right away, and so much of what we're seeing was highlighted, and oftentimes, like Phyllis, you see the Verizon DBIR, and as we know, for years a lot of the attacks weren't relevant to down market, and then obviously about 2 years ago things took a big change where they took out the section right on delineation between SMB and enterprise because there's no statistical difference anymore. Threat actors are equal opportunity now across the board, and we're going to get into it with Clark here, but that's what I saw, and specifically these. A lot of these social engineering, we're going to be talking about malware or lack thereof in this report as well. So I thought it was only fitting to get the man himself who heads up incident response at CrowdStrike, Clark Harshbarger. Clark, welcome back. It's awesome to see you. And, me and Gary being here in our T-shirts, we give you the GQ award as always, showing up here. But
I remember when I had to wear a collar.
What's that?
It's the farmer fed in me.
Exactly that, Gary.
Welcome, Clark. For those that may not know you, could you share a touch about your background, and we'll get on into it here.
Yeah, you bet. Clark Harshbarger. Currently a director of incident response at CrowdStrike. I'm one of about 4 peers, and we head up the entire global incident response program for CrowdStrike. So lots of hands-on war stories and experience, very narrowly focused on the threat report, but a lot of the elements that are described there are things that we see every day. My background, I came from the FBI as a special agent investigating cybersecurity matters, and spent some time at Kroll, and happy to be here at CrowdStrike, firsthand experiencing what we're going to talk about today and dealing with it on a daily basis.
Yeah, and lastly, before I hand it to Phyllis, Clark, thank you for coming to Write a Boom. It was great to see you. Did you have a good time?
It's a space that I think the MSP space, I think, is so incredible and has such talent and importance to our economy and infrastructure. I mean, I can go on and on about it. It's something that I appreciated in the FBI. And I think that the conference Write a Boom was just outstanding to see the reach that it had and the tactical advantage that it's not just talk. It was literally watching people learn about things that could solve real problems, not just talking and training, etc.
Cool. Well, again, thank you for coming and being part of that tabletop exercise in the early event, pre-day event. So awesome to have you. All right, Phyllis.
Sure.
Let me kick it off.
Probably Clark was your highlight at Right of Boom sitting next to me at dinner. Was that?
Seeing you again, Phyllis, is always the delight of the meetings.
Was it enjoying stealing my ice cream, or at least being proxy to steal you
right.
stealing my ice cream? That's a correlative.
Yeah, I mean, we handed back at least some of it.
Yeah, some of it. After we showed the ice cream some love, it was being neglected at your table. So we didn't want it to feel left out.
True story.
So let's get into it. So Clark, before we talk about the report, we'd love to hear what you actually saw in 2024, get some of your insights on some of the attack patterns that made you kind of take a step back and think, that maybe as MSPs, we should be aware of that because of, it was clever or super creative that you saw.
Yeah, so I think my, favorite's a hard thing to talk through because as cybersecurity practitioners, we get excited about successful threat actor activity that, it's wild to see for me every single year the creativity that they bring to the table. And it doesn't take sophistication necessarily to have successes. And I'd say that was the highlight of 2024. It felt like we went back in time 6 years. The report talks about almost 500% increase in vishing attacks, targeting the human element of every organization with very high levels of success. And then it never goes away, but watching threat actors primarily focus on living off the land, LOL attacks using legitimate tools like Quick Assist, TeamViewer, getting users through that vishing to enable remote monitoring tools, remote monitoring and management tools, instead of having to rely on their tool sets, vulnerabilities, and malware to accomplish the same thing. And then the other notable one, I would say, is the famous Kalima and the insider threat attacks, right? Focused around the DPRK, using AI and deep fakes to get the jobs and then persist within those environments, both for financial gain for the government and then focused on just maintaining persistence into those environments.
Yeah, that's a lot. But yeah, it is interesting the way the trend is right now, or what you saw in 24. This is a little bit off script, but what would you say, is it, we often talk about, here at CIS, it's like the kind of basic blocking and tackling, doing that essential cyber hygiene to help folks, defend against these threats. Would you say that would still be in effect or, still be effective?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think the threat actors focus on the user.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't nullify those controls, but really it accelerates the need to intervene on that human side because that bypasses so many of the controls we put in place to protect them.
Right.
But even as we say that, and not to go too far off script, y'all can just give me the hook, is if you were, as a company, well implementing 2.1 and addressing unauthorized software, then as that new RMM popped up, I'd be killing it as those new things. And so you're 100% right. The human's still that barrier of attack on the force function, but we can do better at using the basics, in my opinion, Phyllis, to accomplish those things by mitigating at so many different levels. And CIS does a good job, not to be aggrandizing of CIS right here, but yeah.
Love CIS and whitelisting applications, to Matt's point. If we could do that so that it was exclusively what's used in your environments, I think even small, especially small organizations or MSPs have that ability because there's no reason to run the other 10 primary RMM tools that threat actors are going to pivot to. And then, there's hundreds of others, but if you could whitelist exclusively what you use, you're right, Matt, that cuts down on that attack footprint quite a bit.
The hard part about it is the average MSP and their customer, their SMB, they don't really even know all the apps that their teams use. Mm-hmm. Like, we've gone through this exercise of trying to get our peer members to go out and start asking from a security and an automation standpoint to start to inventory, and all the decision makers at these SMBs are shocked when they find out what's really going on. So like Clark, some of them haven't got to step one.
Right.
And if I could just interject, Matt, I love what you just brought up. Phyllis, I'm going to call out, if he's watching and chime in, but Eric Woodard again on this. Like, I think it's a huge thing, Gary, about, controls 1 and 2. But what Eric's done is he first of all, implementation group 1 is non-negotiable, but as part of his, way he onboards people. But what he does a step beyond that is he has a shared responsibility model. And that I think is really part of his secret. You've always talked about, Gary, your superpower, right? And he's learned a lot from you over the years. I believe he was part of your methodology. But what I was going to say about it is, he delineates right there. He's like, look, if you're not going to let me inventory your stuff, that's on you now, right? Like, you can't hamstring me. And then he basically shows them, like, these are your responsibilities. These are my responsibility. These are our responsibilities. And that's part of his GRC model with them and his ongoing reporting. But it's
just I see that it's hard for MSPs. In order to do that, you have to completely come from an assume breach mentality, which is easier for Eric than other people who went through a breach. And it's just so much harder for other MSPs that I work with every day to get there. But I'm 100% with you, Andrew. Like, this is where everyone needs to live.
This is right. But this is to your point, Garen. I'll give it back to Phyllis, that you talk about, world-class MSP, right? It's okay to aspire to go, where an organization like his has gotten. And he's not some massive MSP. He's not a PE-backed MSP. But to your point, he's lived it. He understands the impact it's had on his organization and his customers. And that shift, right, led him to be one of the leaders now in how he onboards, how he sells, et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah.
And I would say, MSPs and SMBs aren't the only ones who have problems with asset inventory. I would argue that I would say most large enterprises, it could be even more difficult for them. And, Clark and Matt are, nodding their heads, especially as these larger enterprises have, like.
Because most of them, not only they're big and complex, Phyllis, but they almost all do M&A now, which adds a whole nother level of complexity when they're large companies and they're doing, 5, 10, 15 acquisitions. It's difficult.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
I know we're going to dig in, and Phyllis, you and I align that, as Matt said, that those tier 1 CIS controls completely non-negotiable. Get those done. There's no reason not to tackle those first. And that with M&A, with all of the other issues, even with a small SMB or an MSP, break those RMM tools and protect your environment. There's no reason to do that, right? Or no reason not to do that.
Awesome. All righty. So let's go to the CrowdStrike 2025 Global Threat Report. In it, it said that some attacks can escalate in just 51 seconds. So how should MSPs and MSSPs rethink their response strategies to actually keep up with these speeds?
So, first off, that was the exception edge case. Not that that's all the time, but it still dropped from somewhere around an hour to about 48 minutes on average for that breakout time, with breakout time as fast as 51 seconds. I think MSPs need to focus on real-time threat detection, without a doubt, the identity plane, identity controls, and proactive threat hunting. It's never going to get simpler. There's never going to be less controls, but those are the things that I think need to be focused on to address what we've seen in the past year. And then the cloud plane, 35% of cloud intrusions exploited valid credentials. So really focusing on that identity plane, which I would say overlaps with last year, but absolutely essential as we move into this next year.
Interesting. So again, I'm just kind of going off script. Sorry, I'm just so interested. So 1 hour to 48 minutes. I mean, we'll talk about AI. Do you think that played a role, or are they just getting better? Are we just not implementing controls well enough, and it's just like same old, so they're just getting faster? I mean, can you guys figure that out, or is that too, I mean, that's a big ask to try to figure that out. So just out of curiosity.
So we covered a couple of bullets there. From my perspective, anecdotally, I would say that the threat actors enhance their infrastructure capabilities, really focusing on infrastructure patterns that they knew they could escalate quickly in. So rather than targeting organizations that may have a less common layout, they just kept it simple and easy. They know their routines, and once they get in, they know exactly where they're going, what steps, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and keep it simple.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, when you have the tush push, why run another play at the goal line?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that also speaks to the fact that we're not making them work hard enough, right? So if you can just keep reusing the same playbook over and over and over again successfully, we have got to change what we're doing to defend our networks or whatever, or, improve.
I know all of us as practitioners feel the same, but hitting that low-hanging fruit, right? The rotation of local admin credentials, not having that centrally managed. This is, we're talking back in 2016, 17, and yet without a doubt, it's something that we still see threat actors taking advantage of. And so, to Gary's point, why change your patterns if it's working?
Yep, exactly. So Clark, with supply chain attacks continuing to rise, what are the biggest mistakes MSPs are making when securing their clients' infrastructures?
Mistakes that MSPs make versus what the threat actors are targeting. We had a little bit of conversation before we went live and talking about third parties, acquisitions as well. So without a doubt, we're seeing threat actors target these recent acquisitions and weak vendor security controls so that they can exploit third parties and get into protected networks. But we are also seeing, again, in the past year, a very high level of credential abuse as a primary entry vector. MFA bypass techniques, I would say, are a focus, right? One of our controls that we want to implement on that identity plane is MFA. It still is good guidance, but now threat actors have pivoted and they are learning what MFA bypass techniques work very well. One of those is, right, push fatigue on our tokens, and we see a lot of successes in these MFA bypasses, and that's one we can talk about specifics. But
and Clark, these token harvesting and token reuse, the adversary in the middles are just rampant. We see, I work a lot with Jim Lippy and Chip Gary, and the amount of those adversary in the middle attacks and token hijackings are through the roof. I mean, that's what they're arguably probably seeing more than anything right now. So
makes sense.
We also see cloud misconfigurations, cloud configurations that allow for some of these techniques, automatic failover or fallback into less safe techniques, because we're trying to, we're in a migration pattern and we're not fully cloud, and so they have to allow for these fallback methods. See a lot of that, and threat actors know that, so they'll push it out and try and get you to fall over and fall back to a less secure MFA technique.
One, Clark, I'm just going to, and I'll put this in chat. One attack I just recently saw is really fascinating. Matt, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's a platform called EM Client. And it's basically, you can, if you have a bunch of different email addresses, Clark, you can use this one client to go, oh, I want, hook into my Gmail and my Outlook or my, et cetera, and it aggregates everything. And the threat actor successfully phished and then set up a, it wasn't, I forget which file transfer, but he set up a Dropbox with the user's email. And then the IR firm successfully got him out. However, the threat actor continued to use the email account and this EM client was set up as persistence. And they did it through Graph.
Yeah, it's probably an enterprise application registration abuse, right? So they're using an enterprise app in Microsoft and use Graph identity. And really quick, just to add to that, just Tradecraft. Clark, you said earlier how fast the infrastructure has gotten better. Look at the tooling that's gotten better. Bo Bullock's Graph Runner is an amazing device phishing tool I could use, right? It was made for good, but it's great for bad. It's fantastic at registering. It creates a device that has access and persistence to Graph, bless you, right? All of those other things. And so the tooling has gotten faster and better at doing that. But at the same time, Andrew, I've been demonstrating. You can go back on my YouTube. I think my first AITM video was like 6 years ago. Like, I mean, these are the same methodologies we've seen. And I'll let you kind of get it to me for the next piece. But I have some theories as to why we're seeing some of those pivots. And Willie Sutton probably said it best, because that's where the money is, stupid. And so the pivots there.
Yeah, lots of AITM. I mean, we've got a lot of MFA bypass techniques. That's a great one to highlight, though, that is being abused as methods of entry for that.
Yeah.
So Matt, you did a lot of pen tests on MSPs this year, this past year. So did you want to share any insights with the group on what you saw and what we should be doing, working towards?
Sure. We actually did a project called The Hackening, which was really a pen test for free for MSPs that we did a data aggregation project on. About 56 MSPs signed up. Now, remember, that's 56. Gary, how many MSPs out there these days? Like,
that have tools, let's say, let's call it North America, 40,000.
Yeah. So 57, 40,000.
By my definition, like 11
signed up to do this hackening project, which means they're probably the top of that food chain, right? Are the ones that think they're doing well, for us to look at that. And we found that as an overarching theme, 80% of those were using an identity-centric plane. They were 100% Entra or 100% another identity plane. They were extending into SaaS software through modalities such as OIDC or SAML, right? Other type of 5.6 and 6.7 CIS capabilities being put in place. Like, that's 80% of them. The other 20% comprised of exactly what you're talking about with M&A. Both Andrew, Clark, Gary, and Phyllis. With M&A, a lot of these MSPs that are just rolling up companies are leaving their infrastructure there. Meaning, instead of me getting hit by Microsoft Smart Lockout on the front end of a Microsoft license, I'm hitting a back end that I can just spray against LDAP S for the next 13 years until cows come home, right? And so, to Clark's point, that reused credentials becomes worse when I can just keep spraying until I run out of a dictionary file, right? And so there's that kind of capability. And so what we found was it's either those that have moved pure cloud, and that would be the Willie Sutton comment of, well, that's why we're going to attack the tokens, right? And then those that have the extensibility, and in the threat report, you talk about that pivot from on-prem. You just talked about it in downgrading security controls to meet old legacy systems like hybridization. I'm going to attack the on-prem. It's a lot easier. I have a lot more places that I can win there. And then I'll pivot to a cloud account. And you're seeing that, right? You're seeing that pivot to cloud VMs through command and control techniques, all of those other kind of things that were talked about there. So my two things were, Andrew, most MSPs that said we're good enough to be attacked were. They didn't leave a lot of infrastructure. I didn't find tons of vulnerabilities. I didn't find, like, they were doing the things Gary's been talking about for years, right? And so when we get into those that have moved to cloud, though, that means now if you're poor in your cloud practice or your token management, then it does introduce a lot of other attacks. Back to Phyllis in the discussion of 1.1 in the beginning of CIS. If I don't know what my devices are, somebody can go register a device with Graph Runner, and now I have full token access to all of that identity. And you don't know that there's a laptop named Matt's Attack laptop that's actually running as this device GUID, right? So anyways, beleaguering the point. But MSPs are generally, that have been self-selected, prepared. But as to what their cloud posture would be, it just means that depending on how quick they are to respond to that attack, how far is that threat actor going to get? And depending on how many holes they've opened for old legacy infrastructure, right? Those are the kind of the weak points in my mind.
Cool.
You know, I just might add on, agree 100% with everything you said, Matt. And then, but as you're talking, I'm like, well, what can MSPs do immediately? And the threat actors are going to use their easiest method to bypass MFA or anything else. So a couple of low-hanging fruit, easy things. Phishing-resistant MFA. The big one that we've seen is monitor for multiple users registering the same MFA device, right? Threat actor gets in, compromise multiple
call out.
users, you'll see that same device pop up. Super easy to monitor for, take a look. And then the human element, again, making sure that the users are educated about MFA fatigue and social engineering. It's, hate to keep preaching that one, but you can't miss it. MFA fatigue,
Right.
no one's going to push the button if they have that education.
That's
Yeah.
right. Very good. So Clark, earlier we talked about how the criminals are using AI to help with social engineering and phishing attacks. How is it that you think MSPs and MSSPs can leverage AI to help defend their enterprises or their networks?
So good question there. And I might have limited insight other than to say that our EDR product and a lot of other EDR products use AI and machine learning for anomaly detection. I think that is an easy way for me to provide input and say, you use this. Threat actors are using AI to generate phishing emails on top of attack patterns, right? But those phishing emails using LLM generated phishing emails has been somewhere around 50% more successful than it has in the past. We don't get to look for those grammar errors and low hanging fruit. And so from our side, you have to compensate and use AI and ML to your benefit. So my input there is just the EDR product, because that's what I have to offer you, but I'd be curious to hear Gary, Matt, and Andrew's.
Well, can I just ask you a question, Clark? And
yeah,
if this was said differently, I mean, is the fact that EDR on the margin has gotten pretty darn good. Like John Strand talks about this. I mean, in essence, haven't we forced the threat actor to get away from the endpoint to a degree? I'm not saying completely, but we've gotten so good, again, air quotes, right? We've done a good job. So, well, how else can we get them in? The threat actors now, okay, well, I don't want to get, detected, right? So what, let me go to the weakest area. And I think that's why we're seeing this proliferation on the identity attacks more than ever. And the ingenuity behind it, right? That's where the amount of time is being spent now. What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but it's terrifying, but nothing makes me smile more than watching the tool packages that the threat actors are deploying, as well as manual commands trying to disable EDR as soon as they land on an endpoint. You can't help but smile and see that, exactly to your point there, Andrew, that they know this is what's going to stop them. We have gotten very good with EDR products, and so their focus is avoid those endpoints where they can, and when they land on them is get that EDR product off, and they have a lot of methods to do that.
Right. Absolutely.
And to that point, with cloud, I can take the point of inspection out to an adversary in the middle, or graph itself directly, or other places that you have to monitor where you don't have that purview anymore of me. Once I have that token, by default, Microsoft has that token for 90 days, I think. I can go replay that in another browser, exfil emails, take the other stuff, register enterprise apps where allowed, things to that nature. And so it gets you outside of the inspection of traditional EDR, Andrew. For that point, I would agree with you on that statement. And why the malwareless aspect has started becoming so much of Clark's report was that aspect of it. So
I'm just dumbfounded that some people don't know what the tush push is.
I have to confess, I had no idea.
Oh, that's fun. That's fair.
Andrew, did you see I got my Super Bowl watch.
Oh, I thought it was just a Garyism. So I was like, okay, Gary made that up.
It's in the threat report, Phyllis.
So
yeah.
Well, the reason we use the analogy, it's a play that the Eagles run, and a couple other teams to a lesser degree, when they have less than 2 yards, where they kind of load up the middle and they got a big quarterback that does a sneak, and they get people from behind to push. And it's effective. Such a high percentage of the time they're trying to ban it in the offseason, the competition committee. But it's basically when you have a play that works and they run it every time it's under 2 yards, 100% of the time they run it. And if they, have to run it twice in a row, they'll run it twice in a row. So that was the analogy to when you have things that work, you stick to them. And it's better to spend your time looking for environments, as you said, Clark, where that play will work, rather than spending your time having to come up with new plays.
Isn't that interesting, though? I like that as an analogy, because in football, in racing, when you have something that is so successful like that, that literally they change the rules of the game because it's just impossibly successful, that's similar to what the threat actors do. And we have to invent or develop a control that completely nullifies that. Otherwise, we're going to be taken with our pants down.
Very good. All right, over to you, Gary.
Yeah, keep having new rules. Before I ask you the first question, I saw a comment earlier on from Eric saying world class equals like large or PE backed, and I'm going to say that is not true. The case. To me, there is world class organizations at all levels of scale in terms of their discipline, their efficiency, and their process, and there is non-world class at all levels of scale. So I just wanted to make that, designation in terms of what we're trying to, that anyone, wherever they are, can move in that direction. With me on that, Andrew?
Does not equal. I think he said does not equal.
Yeah, maybe he's maybe he was agreeing.
Put an exclamation point.
All right, he was agreeing. All right, Eric. We're on the same
put a not in front of it.
Nice. All right, Eric. Well, it's still a good point to make to everyone.
In the FBI, we used to say big cases, big problems.
Exactly.
Small cases, small problems. These big firms have lots of money, lots of security firms. They also have lots of bureaucracy, and they have lots of different organizations that have been emanated and that they have to implement, and there's a rollout procedure.
I mean, and we know, like, Gary, just real quick. I mean, we know, like, we've talked ad nauseum about this, but whether it's a Colonial Pipeline or other big organizations, we've talked how many times about basic cyber hygiene would have stopped in an inordinate amount of these large scale. I mean, I think it was it Okta, that their service account, and on and on and on. So
Andrew, you teased. So I've had a new modality this year that I'm doing. I've done it for about 240 people, taking modern, well-written breach reports. So like the Cisco Talos write-up, on the Cisco breach, and then looking at them as a kill chain, aligning those to what we think failed, and then tying those to the safeguard failures. And it almost invariably comes back to a 1.1, a 2.1, a 4.1, a 9.1, a lot of the basic IG1s. And so to Andrew, there's like doing that mental breakdown shows how many of these major corporations, sorry, all the people that I've done this for, have massive failures in just the basics in that regard. So
Matt, you don't have to do all that work. You could have just asked Phyllis. You already told us that 100 times.
True story. Phyllis, but I'm taking the practitioners through the journey.
Phyllis, do you guys still do the community defense model? Has it been updated?
Yeah. We're actually going to update it this year to CDM 3.0, the community defense model. Yep.
Okay. And just quick plug, I think it's important for people to know about that and Google it and look at it, because it's really the foundation for why it's really looking at things in reverse, but why the foundation of the IG1 controls are so critical. Maybe can you just give a quick snippet of why that's so critical, Phyllis?
Yeah, sure. So, we looked at dozens and dozens of threat reports, got the top 5 worldwide threats. As we said in the beginning of the call, regardless of size, every organization is facing the same types of threats. And then we got the different attack patterns and MITRE ATT&CK. CrowdStrike gave us one. Thank you. And then we mapped safeguards as mitigations to those attack techniques and sub-techniques. And that's how we came up with our prioritization. And so we were able to say, if you implement IG1, you can defend against 70% or sometimes in the low 80% against those attacker sub-techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK model. So then you can extrapolate and say, look, these attack techniques or sub-techniques are used across multiples of attacks, not just these 5. And so you can really defend against a lot of top threats, right? And, like privilege escalation is practically used in almost every single attack type, right? And so, these are the types of things that organizations need to implement, and that's how we came up with IG1. We put in a separate factor of how easy or hard is it to implement. So that's why something like application allow listing is not in IG1, because it is complicated. I mean, I agree, application allow listing can defend against many, many, many types of attacks for sure. But it's very difficult to implement.
So that's awesome, Phyllis. So Clark, ransomware groups, like you're talking about today, they continue to, evolve. in terms of their attacks. You mentioned 80% of attacks are malware free. So what new trends did 2025 report highlight? And more specifically, how should MSPs adapt their defenses and their security offerings based on what you're saying?
Boy, to me, that's not even a new trend. And, Matt spoils the goods on all of that, but that's the bottom line, right? Is these living off the land tools are successful. To your point, it's the tush push. It's so successful. So whitelisting not only RMM, but those tools that are able to be used within your environment. That's the key. It's not sophistication. It's not a new technique. It's meet us where we are. There's others like leveraging WMI. So that's, privileged account protection and making sure that those living off the land tools aren't accessible if they get access within your environment.
Yep. So you already talked about, bypassing MFA, how that's really starting to be alarming in terms of what you're seeing. You talked a little bit about some of the identity security layers MSPs should prioritize. Can you just dive a little deeper into that?
Sorry, was that for me or for Matt?
No, that's for you, Clark.
Oh, ask the question again. I got distracted for just
Okay, no problem. So I'm talking about bypassing MFA and the increase you're seeing. You used the word at an alarming rate. So, when you look at identity security layers, what should MSPs be prioritizing right now to counter that?
Oh boy. So I do less implementation. I think that might be better for Matt to address. And
I got this one right in the wheelhouse on that regard. So first and foremost, you've already mentioned it, Clark, right? If you have your clients and you can educate them about passwordless, Net said that in the chat, right? The passwordless methodologies that are themselves somewhat phishing resistant, then you at least create a whole class of attacks that go away. I can't now in the middle phish this in the same way. I'd have to get it off your cold dead hands or your browser. So that's the first piece that I would say is encouraging your clients to use phishing resistant methodologies for MFA, in increasing that. And as you think about that, you should also be thinking about risk-based decisions in that. What's nice is you might have a lower barrier to entry for one thing and a higher barrier to entry for where the crown jewels are, or the more sensitive aspects and applications. And I would say for the MSPs, at the very least, when it comes to that MFA additional security layers for their clients, it really is don't bring their own death to them. Meaning, if you're going to have admin access, if you are going to be in their environment, if you're going to live in their world, then you should at least adhere to the level of security scrutiny that you're asking them to, and be using increasingly difficult MFA as you get into increasingly larger things. I used to do things like email, fine. You can do that with MAM protection or mobile application management. But you want to step into the RMM, you're going to need, and Eric does this too, you're going to need a higher level of MFA to get into the RMM and do stuff for these thousands of endpoints that you have access to, right? And so I think there's the two modalities. Help them be better with their own identity security, and there's stuff we're going to get into later. And then also don't bring their own death, right? Do follow those safeguards yourself, IG1, IG2, probably at least as an MSP. Yeah.
That's really good. And when go ahead.
All I would add, and it's Matt covered the topic well. From my side, it's the real-time identity protection, right? On top of the controls you're going to implement that are just part of your identity infrastructure. From an EDR side, most EDR platforms, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, and the other popular ones have some kind of identity plane to give you real-time identity protection. And I think that that's a critical need right now, is not just having the controls, but then real-time.
Well, and since you can't do it, but I can, a plug for MDR. The argument here, if you think about even back to the MFA fatigue, there should be a clipping level that's ascribed in Control 13 to say, hey, that was not really Phyllis trying to sign into this. Why? Because she missed MFA 47 times. Let's draw that clipping level at 3 instead of 47, right? So there's those practices and controls that do come into play from an identity perspective that is, to your point, Clark, all about, do the hands know what they're looking at, and can they make a determination whether to isolate this account or not because they have a credential it looks like they're using, but they're not passing MFA 15 times. Those are the kind of things that need
5 and not 3, because I probably would hit that limit every day, because after I get
that's why it's a clipping level.
Before the clock runs out, I'm doing something else and I forget that I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Gary, great points.
Yeah. So just, well, and that's a good, like 2 points you made there. I made a joke about, where you said it, and you made the point, Matt, not just for MSPs, but for their customers. really having to understand their environment and don't apply the same level of rigor everywhere, because you're just going to wear the customer out. They're going to be resistant to all of it. And so, take the time to understand where you need to be more aggressive, right? And explain it to the client what that means to them in their business. And I think too many MSPs go horizontal across their customers, and they get more pushback and resistance than they probably need to. Yeah, for sure. So, Clark, we know that MSPs, for the most part, don't have any in-house threat hunting capabilities. So what are there any steps they can take to identify threats proactively?
Well, Matt already plugged MDR. When you don't have a capability in-house, you either have to accept the risk or offload that risk to somebody else who has those tools.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great step. It's not something you can just skip unless you are accepting the risk and the liability that goes with that. So offloading that to a team that has that capability, and there are lots that target MSP specifically and bring that in at a good price.
You don't want to know how many SMBs do not have MDR today, but it's the average MSP does not have it everywhere, and part of it's been legacy because of the pricing structure. But I think that's been removed. The price on it has come down. I mean, basically, Kaseya includes it. It's basically, free. But I still don't see people, even with that, putting it, everywhere. It's really, it's one simple thing, right, that people can do.
I had this conversation at Right of Boom, Andrew, and it's insightful for me because I primarily work with large organizations, but feeling the pain of an MSP that's grown over the past 20 years, there's never a time you get to sit on your laurels, right? And so now, understanding and finding that right price point for you have to have EDR, unacceptable not to have EDR. And then now there are capabilities that you need, like threat hunting and MD within those MDR capabilities. Yep. So matching the right price point, even if there's a better product or a better solution, but finding something that gives you that good middle ground so that you're addressing the threat and then either accept the risk or compensate with other controls and tools.
Gary, but Clark just said something that I think is important, because you've talked about this. He said, MSPs resting on the laurels. We worry an industry that could rest on our laurels through about
for like the first 15 years I was in it. You could rest on your laurels, and the only thing that happened to you was you didn't grow as fast or make more money.
Right.
And now over the past 5 years, increasingly, it's completely untrue. Doing nothing has so much more risk, has dramatic risk compared to how it was 6 years ago.
Yeah, it's staggering, the difference.
And just to highlight, I know we've talked about some good examples of small and mid-sized MSPs that have implemented controls, but really, number one, transparently identifying each of those risks. If that's not part of your annual review with those that you're servicing and talking through, here are the risks we've seen as we're talking about this now, then you as the MSP are accepting those risks and those liabilities. So labeling them, identifying them, and either dealing with it or transferring that risk, I think, is absolutely key and critical. And the best thing we can do to keep the customer, I would say, is implement controls that protect you versus just transfer the risk.
Yep. And Clark, just to add on what you talked about earlier, Andrew, when you're talking about Eric and his model, you can't have a shared risk model if you haven't identified and explained the risk correctly to your customers. By definition, that is not possible.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, that sounds expensive. Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I'll start with, first off, Eric in the comments is nailing it right. We've got to make it easier for users to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong. So I'll just give a quick shout out for all the comments there in the chat. Clark, in this, we talked about before that the report highlights a surge in attackers like impersonating the us's of the world, right? Hi, this is Matt at Choose Networks. I need to get into your machine, right? And even with the point of Andrew making earlier of a pretexting methodology where you send a lot of spam first and then pretend like you're calling to say, hey, I'm here to fix your problem, right? In that regard. And so you're seeing that, like, how can we train employees and clients to better train and recognize the attempts? And then I'll give my thoughts on it. But Clark, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, great question. I think a lot of areas to focus on, but easy ones thinking from a threat actor perspective, many of these attacks occur outside of normal business hours, so the threat actor has a less confident or less involved individual, right? Maybe you hand off to a third party or a contract service that handles some of those calls and accounts. They have a longer window to develop their intrusion. So number one, training those individuals or finding a control that intervenes within that particular attack vector. And then one that we've implemented on the order of insider risk, but I think is applicable here, is video verification. You know, silly things like video verification have to hold up a physical ID that matches, and of course that's easy to get for a threat actor. Restricting password resets to self-service portals with identity verification, and then there's lots of AI tools out there that can help with voice analysis. Is this a deep fake? Is this, you know, what's the chance that we are having a threat actor use AI to drive some of these threat vectors? So those are a few that I could think of right off.
I'd add to that, because all of those would be viable as methodologies to try to detect that fake, right? Like, turn your head, please, Clark. Let's make sure you're really Clark, and right, those things. But in addition, what if we thought simpler? And I'll call this the Eric rule right here from the chat. I was saying, what if instead I, as an MSP, set up a cryptographic method to validate my users? Meaning, let's say I'm going to send you a push from an enterprise application in Entra that's going to show up on your phone, and you're going to need to validate that that's you. Right now, at least in this case, it does train that someone's going to do that in a way. Now, there's other risks that somebody in the chat can definitely bring up. I have in my mind. But if you always did that as an MSP, you're now validating your client. You're at least validating that end of the social engineering challenge. They have to have at least compromised that person before ability to intervene, right? But in the same breath, if I ever, as an MSP, do not validate you as a user, you would be able to train those users that means I'm not the MSP. If anybody ever calls you and doesn't validate with this push that's going to show up just like this with my logo on it and this enterprise app we inject in your environment, then now it's not me. You now can train at least that social engineering attack that's harder to do of me coming, because it's never going to happen. You'd expect the client to validate my face or my badge. It's just not likely at that scale for an SMB. But the obverse could be done, right? Where we always train them to understand that we're going to validate you. Every ticket you put in, we're going to validate you. We're going to make sure you're you. Now, if you have an identity crisis or you can't get in, not like a existential one, but like a technical identity crisis, then we're going to have methods to overcome that potentially, right? Is the technical method. But I like the idea of both direction validation of your identity. It's a lot harder to go the other way, but yeah.
Keep it simple. You could implement any one of our folks could implement that today, Matt. That's a great approach.
There's code out there that's free. The other thing I wanted to talk about too was with the voice and email impersonation being better, right? You kind of touched on this a little bit. How do you train your support teams if you don't have some other methodology we just talked about to validate those users? What are some thoughts for anybody who wants to chime in on that, or Clark?
Boy, that's a challenge, and that without a doubt is going to get better and better this year. So even our real-time verification techniques are going to require additional methods for us. So anomaly detection, AI detection, you're not going to be able to get by because we have such a propensity for these remote validations. You're going to have to integrate that into your workflow. I guess there's no questions asked. It's already on the table. We have to deal with it.
One more place to take this now is I'm an MSP. Gary, you're running your MSP again, and you get a call from ConnectWise or from Datto or from, I'm not trying to pick on anyone, but you get a call, shows up as a Tampa number. They say, hey, listen, we're seeing some problems with this. We want to look at your systems and help you with this problem, right? That side of the supply chain attack, right? So this brings us back to, we've seen a rise in attackers posing as third-party vendors for those IT companies as well. Like, any thoughts on how you would teach MSPs to validate their supply chain? I lost Clark. Gary or Andrew, you want to take a poke at that, of validating your vendors, your supply chain vendors?
Yeah. Go
ahead. So from my perspective, requiring out of band authentication, right? Not just built-in controls. And then part of our job too is monitoring those vendor accounts and vendor accesses, which we don't do. A lot of times, well, I can't say we don't do, but I would say that I see in my incident response activities, a lot of times Once those vendor accounts are provisioned, they are just not monitored as close as privileged accounts or user accounts.
Yeah. Control 5.5, right? Extensibility of service account management and monitoring. And one of the things I keep coming back to, and I have slept on the CIS handbook for long enough to have memorized every single control and safeguard, but is that there's almost always an answer for it, right? When we talk about that, that's all of Control 15 is have a list of your vendors starting in 15.1, be able to say who's your contact points for that out of band comms, Clark, to your point in 15.2, and right. So when we think about these things, there's always a safeguard. So my takeaway from this, and then I'll hand it back to you, Andrew, is if you just follow the safeguards as your guide, and if you look at that as ways of how did somebody else die, how can I improve so I don't, right? That whole survivorship bias methodology, then you can probably get through most of this. It's in the basics, especially as the practitioner. Andrew, I'll hand it back to you on that.
Yeah,
I was going to say that's a scary one, Matt. And it's like you said, what you just mentioned of a vendor, like that's potential death sentence. And so when you have the highest level of impact to an MSP business, I think you're just dramatic in terms of like vendors cannot request ever any access. There has to be multiple people that are signing off on that, no matter what, with no exceptions, a job issue.
Just in time privileges. I think that's great, Gary, right? It's inconvenient. Vendors often want unfettered access, but enforce that inconvenience and give them just in time privileges.
Yep.
Yeah, Gary, it's similar to how we finally had to put, better controls in because of business email compromise, right? You can't, it was before an email would be acceptable about changing accounts, but you can't do that, whether it's a mortgage or whatever. There's multi-steps is your point.
Yep. Absolutely.
I'll throw this to you first, Clark. We have a few minutes left. But I'd love all your take on the following. And it's about security awareness training. Like, are we behind? And what I mean by that is when you look at the attack types right now, right? The identity attack types, those are hard to teach an end user per se. Like, let me walk through what an adversarial in the middle is going to do, and let me walk through how, certainly you could do maybe help desk impersonation and spam bombing. But when I take when I take SAT, and I still do, I don't see the latest, right? In terms of attack patterns, in this pivot to these latest techniques that we're seeing incredibly successful. So let me take first you on that, Clark, and and then I got a sub question for you, Matt or Gary, on that.
Great. I think Matt's highlighted it several times today, and I don't mean to throw shade on Congress, but this is a lot like our laws, right? Congress is never going to be developing laws and policies that revolve around the latest needed cyber protections and controls. So as security leaders and teams, we have to, where we can, put controls as intervention. So the training is absolutely critical, but you're right. We need to be simulating this year phishing and social engineering attacks. And while it's not new, it's the focus of what the threat actors are doing now. And the training you're going to receive probably isn't centered around that. So we have to be able to intervene with our controls. The one that we can do is the use of AI by threat actors so that they don't get noticed as quickly for these social engineering attacks is something we can detect and put tools and controls in place right now. So I guess that's my perspective is let's put in multi-step verification for sensitive requests and use that AI anomaly detection, and then take care of our other controls, but continue to do the best we can with the training for our users. Nobody likes it. It's never up to date, but we have to maintain that because it is the low hanging fruit.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. What do you got?
I'd add to that. So Clark's tackling the make it easier for users to do the right thing, right? And harder to do the wrong. That's the first half of this. I think that's always a compendium that needs to play. Like, make it harder for them to mess up. But at the same time, 14 doesn't say train your users. Control 14 says train your users so that they recognize an attack. We have definitely failed in the latter half, at least by measurement, by my understanding, because they don't recognize it. And so the point is, as you dig into 14, and I teach a class on this where I spend a lot of time in 14, it says to talk about actually which systems I use. It doesn't say just job function in general. Hey, you're an accountant. You do accountant-y things. Do this. No. How often do we actually train on the process for that company that's actually for that? Like my users and my technicians will only install Screen Connect. And if you ever see TeamViewer, like how often do we actually get into the granularity of it? So we're expecting to train on non-granular stuff and not teach them what they actually need to do, and then succeed on the finer points of the granularity. Meaning when a threat actor comes in and installs Screen Connect and we weren't using it, nobody's told them that's not okay. And so I think there's a challenge of we as an industry will get better at teaching people, not throwing data at people. We've done it in every other facet of industry. If you want to be a successful company, you execute and you operate, and you teach your people how to execute and operate in those things. We just haven't put that attention on the computer systems and on the information they touch and on the crown jewels. We've done it in every other facet. I know how to lock out and tag out to do an overhaul of this particular physical piece of equipment. But how do we handle that with computers, and where we touch our data has not been really accepted? We just fly through the training and it's useless. All right, I'll get off my soapbox before I fall and break my neck.
Yeah, well, as I'm listening to you, Matt and Clark and Phyllis and so many smart people that we have come on every week here, I just have a different lens because I'm working with MSPs every day, the reality of MSPs, especially the ones that are new when I just meet them, for the first time. And so what I want to make sure my message is business maturity always precedes security maturity.
Mhm.
100%.
And we have an industry where more MSPs are immature operationally than are mature. No offense, right? But that's not my opinion. That's my observation. And so we need to make sure that we understand, and we're solving for both things, because it's not just making a few extra dollars like it was in the old days when you lagged behind. This is the future of your business and the future of your customers' businesses. Like the stakes are so much higher. Like every MSP has an obligation, right, to take both of those steps, business and security maturity.
Yeah, it's probably a really good place to end, Gary. And you've pointed that out many times, right? It was the leaders out of the pandemic have been the leaders, since they've been the leaders in automation. They've been, and it directly is a function of business maturity, isn't it?
100%. And their lead is getting bigger, not smaller. And that's why, it's why I'm still spending my time here, because there's still more work to do, right, in our industry.
Yeah.
And it's important work.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to put up Gary's cell number so you can go direct to him. It's 1-800-ASK Gary, and not to be confused with the attorney firm, Gary.
Right.
So, all right. Well, hey,
1-800, right? Peer or die.
Clark, thank you so much for coming on. This was awesome, as it is every year with you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Clark.
Hope to have you on again. Matt, thanks for filling in and really sharing some great perspective as a co-host. Everybody out there, thanks for tuning in, as you always do, and we'll see you next Monday. Phyllis, Gary, as always, thanks a million.
Go Birds.
See you guys. Tush push.
Thanks.